No other automaker has ever been as dominant as GM was between 1948 and 1972. During that era, there were periods when GM controlled more than 50% of the market. More than that, GM was revolutionizing the automotive industry. From small block V8 engines to automatic transmissions to bold styling. GM was setting new standards of design and engineering innovation every now and then. GM is responsible for the vast majority of iconic models that define the muscle car era, and this video is about the best of the best, about the top 10 muscle cars GM produced between 1948 and 1972. Stay with us and enjoy. Although Buick was primarily known for luxury and refinement back in the day, it's not like it wasn't a muscle car powerhouse. Moreover, it released a couple of iconic models that made it to this list with ease. One of them is called the Skylark GS, a model that blends brute force with refinement in such a nice way. Introduced in 1965, the GS, which stands for Grand Sport, was offered as an optional package in the Skylark range, with various performance upgrades, starting with the good old Nailhead V8, known as one of the most durable engines of the era. The Skylark was as compatible as any GM muscle car, but at the same time, it offered a smoother ride and a more upscale interior compared to its Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, or Pontiac counterparts. Moreover, even the exhaust system was toned down, not as loud as you would expect from a car with such an engine. A perfect sleeper, some would say. Then things got even crazier in 1970, when the Skylark GS got an engine upgrade with the new 455 V8 that was good for 510 pound-feet of torque, the highest of any American production car at the time. With this engine, the GS was a genuine drag beast, even available with further upgrades in the form of Stage 1 and Stage 2 performance packages that were impressive enough to put pretty much any Hemi-powered rival to shame. Introduced in 1962, the Grand Prix was one of the first American cars to blend personal luxury with performance. Compared to most other raw muscle cars of the era, this one stood out with its stylish coupe layout and fancy European-inspired details, such as bucket seats and center console, things that were still rare in American cars back in the day. The long hood, short deck, the Grand Prix had a commanding presence, which was followed by, we would say, a more than adequate powertrain, considering that the good old 389 V8 was available with a tri-power carburetor setup. By the end of the decade, the Grand Prix would grow and become even more luxurious, not to mention the top-tier SJ model that got the 428 V8 and offered even better performance. The Grand Prix was never as aggressive as GTO or Firebird, but it was way more refined. It proved that luxury and performance can be in perfect symbiosis, and that's why we think its place on this list is more than well deserved. Chevy Nova was one of those models that broke the rules. GM engineers realized that muscle cars don't necessarily need full-size proportions, and that lightweight and a better power-to-weight ratio are key determining factors when it comes to performance and driving experience. The original model, known as the Chevy 2, was introduced in 1962, but 1966 was the breaking point when we saw the Nova SS badge, a compact coupe with a 327 V8 producing 350 horsepower. By 1970, the Nova SS would get further performance upgrades, starting from the 396 big block with 375 horsepower, the same engine found in the much bigger and heavier Chevelle SS. The Nova SS became an outright street monster, smaller, more agile, and quicker off the line than more powerful rivals. And even though it never got the fame of Camaro or Chevelle, its raw power and affordability made it a favorite among enthusiasts. Today, the Nova SS is a legend, one of the most sought-after Chevy muscle cars, highly appreciated for its balance of power, lightweight, and no-nonsense styling approach. America's most iconic sports car may not look like a typical muscle car of the era, but in the 1960s and early 1970s, it belonged to the segment with all of its heart and soul. Because even though it was much nimbler than a typical muscle car, thanks to its compact dimensions, lightweight, and revolutionary independent rear suspension, the massive V8 under the hood is what made it a muscle car. Because while early models were powered by a relatively modest 150 horsepower inline-six, later years would bring genuine V8 to the table, including the legendary L88 with 430 horsepower, though unofficial reports claim a much higher actual rating, over 500 horsepower. Then the early 1970s brought further upgrades in the form of another legendary engine, the 454 LS6, with a max output of 425 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. The muscle car phase in Corvette's evolution would end in 1972 with higher insurance rates and newer emissions regulations. We could say that models between 1965 and 1972 represent the most brutal years of the classic Corvette, a time when this icon earned the status of America's premier sports car. Originally introduced in 1964 as an option package for the F85 and Cutlass, the 442 would become a standalone model in 1966. And if you wonder where the name comes from, it's not the engine displacement. No, it rather stands for the 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed manual, and dual exhaust. 3 quintessential features that would remain unchanged in the following years. Besides the name, the 442 was also famous for its upscale engineering, which set it apart from corporate siblings like Chevelle SS. The 442 was focused on a balanced approach. It was powerful, but it also offered excellent handling and a really smooth ride due to a pretty advanced suspension setup. Initial versions featured quite capable 400 cubic inch V8 with 350 horsepower, while the culmination would happen in 1970, when the 442 was introduced with the legendary 455 V8 with 365 horsepower and monstrous 500 pound-feet of torque. But despite all that power, the 442 remained sophisticated, with a well-appointed interior and smooth ride, which is the reason why it remained one of the most respected muscle cars up to these days. We've reached the top 5 GM muscle cars, and the thing is that, in whichever order we put these models that are coming, we will be wrong, because it's impossible to tell which of these legends deserves more recognition than others. So, consider the rest of the countdown just a formal thing. The point is that these models could come in any order, and things would still be just fine. In any way, the Pontiac Firebird is one of GM's most iconic ponies. Designed to compete with Mustang, the Firebird was introduced in 1967, and even though it's based on the same platform as the Camaro, there is so much personality and so much flair that Pontiac engineers were able to transfer to this design. Of course, it was a high-performance pony with a range of V8 engines from 326 to 400 cubic inch units. But Pontiac has always been the most unique member of GM's family, and in this case, that reflected through a couple of experiments, such as the one when the company tried to replace V8s with the high-output overhead cam inline-six, one of the most advanced engines of the era. The new generation arrived in 1970, and things got even crazier, with even more powerful engines, including the legendary 455 V8 with 480 pound-feet of torque. But before that, the second generation brought the most iconic variant of the model, the Firebird Trans Am, with ram air engines with a max output that goes up to 400 horsepower, which made it one of the fiercest street machines of its time. Today, the Firebird is one of the biggest legends in muscle car history, famous for Pontiac's flair for engineering and unique design approach. As we already mentioned, the Buick was primarily associated with comfort and refinement, but that didn't stop it from making one of the most legendary muscle cars of all time. Famous for its eye-catching Saturn yellow and Apollo white paints, combined with bold stripes and an aggressive rear spoiler, the GSX definitely wasn't a typical Buick of the era. And things were even crazier under the hood, considering that the big block 454 was the engine of choice with 510 pound-feet of torque and max output close to 400 horsepower, even though the official rating was 360 horses to keep insurance rates reasonable. But the GSX was anything but a raw beast. It was much more than a straight-line performer. Its light from front end and advanced suspension made it one of the best handling big block muscle cars around. It blended power and refinement in such a nice fashion, but due to Buick's upscale reputation, it remained a pretty rare bird. So rare that only 678 GSX models were built in 1970. In other words, the GSX is one of the rare and most sought-after muscle cars today. Despite that the inspiration for the name came from European racing legends, GTO stands for Gran Turismo Omologato, and the purpose of this model was all-American, to the point that most enthusiasts would agree that this was the first genuine muscle car, one that kicked the muscle car era, where everything was about raw power and straight-line performance. Initially an option package, it became a standalone model in 1966, and since then, we have seen all kinds of variants packed with a variety of engines, including the legendary 389 with 325 or 348 horsepower. The following years would bring higher performance variants, including the famous GTO Judge, famous for its wild colors, bold graphics, and standard Ram Air 400 cubic inch V8 with 366 horsepower. In 1970, Pontiac also introduced a 455 HO version with 500 pound-feet of torque, so the GTO remained a dominant force until the end of its production, which would come with the arrival of the oil crisis. But that didn't stop it from gaining the status of one of the most legendary names in muscle car history, a model that perfectly embodies the spirit of attitude and rebellion. Back in the day, GM desperately needed something to rival the super popular Mustang, and even though the Camaro never reached the sales figures of Ford's Pony, its commercial success was huge, which, along with superior mechanics, ensured it the status of one of the most iconic muscle cars ever made. The catch with Camaro was in GM's F-body platform. While the Mustang clearly showed its economy car roots, the Camaro was more upscale, with way more advanced chassis setup that included front subframe and coil spring rear suspension, ensuring superior ride quality compared to its key rival. Of course, none of that would mean much without a proper powertrain. And Camaro has so much to offer, starting from the smaller inline 6 units in base versions. The Camaro SS came with a 396 big block, while the Z28, designed for Trans Am racing, used a 302 V8. Then the second generation came in 1970 and brought the new look along with new engines, including a couple of monstrous units like the famous SS 454 with 450 horsepower, and the status of one of the fiercest ponies ever made. It's needless to say that this list is entirely subject, but if we are about to be straight, a vast number of Chevy fans would agree with us that the Chevelle is the greatest muscle car GM ever made, because it had it all. The Chevelle was a powerhouse from its beginning in 1964, though it definitely came into its own in 1966, with the introduction of SS trim, equipped with a 396 big block with 375 horsepower. Then the 1968 model came, completely redesigned with that legendary fastback design. The Chevelle is loved for many reasons, including the fact that it was more upscale than most other muscle cars. Eventually, it all came down to performance, with the culmination in the form of the Chevelle SS 454 LS6, with one of the most monstrous engines of the era. That big block V8 was officially rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, though many believe that the actual rating was much closer to 500 horsepower, which ensured quarter-mile times under 13 seconds. The Chevelle was capable of embarrassing pretty much anything on the road those days, and it would do that in style, with superior ride quality, well-appointed interior, and stylish appearance, rounding up the design that we think is the best GM offered in the so-called golden era. What do you think of our list? Is this the order you expected? And how would your list look? Write in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There is much more to find on our channel. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.